Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to the first edition of 2024 of Red versus Blue. My name is Mike Stark.
And I'm Keith Curry. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Everything go good on the holidays, Keith?
It did. We had peace on earth in the Curry family.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing because a lot of families didn't have peace on earth.
That's true, unfortunately.
Well, anyway, we're back and we're going to hit the ground running because this is the year that the world may change or not. But we're going to cover a few things today that have come up. I think the first thing we want to talk about, and this is what you proposed to me, and it actually makes sense. We touched on it in the past, how the real world working people are not experiencing the improving economy, which is happening in other sectors. You and I have talked about our own personal portfolios and how they have done really well over the last couple of months. But the working people, the middle class, is not experiencing the improving economy in any real way. And it makes me wonder what's going on here. And I turn to you, my friend, for insight on this.
Well, you're not alone, Mike. I'm sure that this is the most vexing question in the White House and amongst President Biden and his advisors. The jobs report came out today. It was good, although when you look under the hood, a lot of the job growth was in government jobs and not in transportation and not in agriculture, food service, that kind of thing.
Right.
But real people are having a disconnect between being told that the economy is getting better and that Bidenomics is good for them and what they see in their own lives. And over the holidays, some things just came out in the media that I think sort of exemplify why this is the case and why Democrats would be wise to think about how their policies really play out amongst people. There was an internet meme, and I saw 3 or 4 people posted it, but it was posted by a Democratic friend of mine that let people know that at the beginning of the year, if you put your tip at a restaurant on your credit card bill, that now instead of it being distributed to the waiter at the end of the night, it's going to be taken up and distributed back to the waiters in a form of a check so that it can be taxed. And the advice of the meme was to therefore tip in cash so that the waiter can avoid taxes, which shows that even Democrats are keen in tax avoidance when the rubber hits the road.
Right.
But, being sort of the smartass that I was, I posted, my comment section was, it looks like Biden's 80,000 IRS inspectors are jolly on the job getting things done. And that's an example, to be serious about it, of a real life bureaucratic decision that hits people who work as waiters and waitresses where they live in a way that's having apparently very dire or could have dire economic repercussions for them. Right. And it's all because somebody who's a bureaucrat thinks we need to be more efficient about tax collection and more bureaucratic and have more paperwork on small business and have that happen.
Right.
And, most Democrats, just like my friend who made that post, see that and they go, this is not right. Let's figure out how to circumvent it. Item number 2, and this is not from Biden, but it is a Democratic policy. Here in California, the minimum wage went up to $16 on January 1st. But if you're a fast food worker, it went up to $20, maybe $25. So Pizza Hut laid off in response to that, directly in response to that, 2,000 delivery drivers. They're going to go with Uber Eats, more expensive options for people. And so despite the fact that, jobs may be growing, 2,000 people who needed an entry-level job to deliver pizza to put food on their table lost theirs. And that's happening across the country throughout industry because of these policies that everybody says, well, how can you complain about raising the minimum wage to $20 an hour for fast food workers? Well, it's because it will result in fewer fast food workers. Right. And in fact, Chick-fil-A just raised the prices 20%. Because of having to deal with that. So if you used to go eat fast food because it was cheap, you're going to find that to be a lot more expensive going forward. And the other thing is, if you're used to telling your waiter or the guy at the counter at Burger King how to have your burger your way, you need to be getting used to how to punch buttons on a kiosk because there's going to be a lot fewer people working behind the counter. I, over the weekend, stopped at a In-N-Out and there were like 10 people working there. I'm not sure how long that's going to be, but I did notice the price was higher for number 2. At Jack in the Box, in the very same shopping center, there's two people working. There's a guy on the grill, and there's a woman with a headset who's taking orders at the counter and working the drive-through window. So that's going to be the future going forward, is you're going to place your order at a kiosk. It's going to be delivered up to you, and there'll be a lot fewer kids. And that's particularly for minority and immigrant kids. The first job they get is at a fast food place. Those jobs are going to disappear because of this misguided policy, along with the higher prices. And then finally, there was a comment, I don't know whether it was on one of the travel sites. Someone had rented a budget rent-a-car, and they were given an electric car, and it wasn't apparently fully charged. This was not in California, it was in the Midwest. And the guy had a hell of a time finding a place to charge the car to finish his trip. He ended up in a shopping center parking lot and walking the mall for 2 hours while his car charged, because he had this car, he didn't know how to use it, didn't like it. I actually got one the other day, and I didn't like it either. Americans don't want electric cars. A lot of them, they don't want to rent them, they don't want to buy them, they don't want to be forced to buy them. And yet policies continue to force that on people. And what they're seeing in the auto industry is that the automakers are losing money despite all the subsidies on electric cars. The price of lithium has dropped, so people are not mining lithium. So the batteries are now, you have a supply chain scarcity issue. And people are just being forced to do stuff they just don't want to do. It's like the old diamond lanes when they put them on the 10 freeway of government saying, it's good for you, shut up and do it. Well, people are saying, no, I don't like that. I don't want to do it, and I'm not going to do it. So the heavy hand of regulation and taxation, and let's try to regulate the economy in a ways that forces up wages in a non-market-based way, is having an effect. And it's having an effect that people are feeling not only at the gas pump, but the cost of bacon is double what it used to be, that the administration is not recognizing and not dealing with. And in fact, the policies are exacerbating both the policies of Biden, but in California specifically, the policies of the legislature and the governor are making the economy worse. And that's the Democratic dilemma this year.
How do you explain then, with all of these things, which are all legitimate discussion points, that yours and my portfolios continue to rise? How do you explain that part of the equation? Because if these things are affecting the middle class, you would think that it would affect the stock market and other aspects. Any thoughts on that? Not that you're a financial wizard, but
I do watch it carefully. The stock market gains in November and December are the result of market expectations and statements by Jerome Powell that the Federal Reserve Board has done raising interest rates, and now they're going to begin cutting interest rates. There's speculation whether it's going to be in March or whether it's going to be in June or July, but they believe, the market believes, Mr. Market believes, that the next move in rates is going to be down, and there's going to be multiple moves down. Now, ironically, because that's going to lower the cost for businesses to borrow money, to do business, to expand, and that, not more consumers having more money in their pocket, is what's driving the increase in values of stocks. There were bubbles in technology and artificial intelligence that drove stocks to significant highs. Now the financial stocks, energy was high because of the events in the Middle East. So that's what drove that part of the market. Retail was a pretty good Christmas, so that sort of raised consumer spending in retail. But the real driver was the expectation of lower interest rates. Now, ironically, lower interest rates are predicted because the economy is cooling and beginning to slow down a little bit. So it's sort of a glass half full kind of story. It's going to be good for the stock market. It's going to be perhaps bad for the consumer. It will ultimately help the consumer because you can then go out and get a mortgage, buy a house.
Sure.
But it doesn't pretend that we're in, clear sailing economic times going forward in the year ahead. It's going to be choppy. And part of the reason why rates are going to fall is because the economy is thought to be softening.
Yeah, but if rates fall, businesses are able to invest more and all of that. Of course, they will pass those savings that they get onto the consumer, right?
Well, not
the old trickle down. Your buddy Reagan, the old trickle down theory, right?
They're going to pass it to the stockholders like you.
The other thing, and I'm looking at a larger picture of this, is you go to a restaurant on a Saturday night, and there's a line a mile long to go to eat there. And the prices are higher and everything else, but These are working class people that are going to these restaurants and so on. You go to a concert. Concert tickets have never been higher in price, but people are buying them and going. Is this just the middle class being irresponsible?
Well, no, it's a bifurcated economy. It's always been that way. Some people are doing very well. But the reason why there's a line at your restaurants is because there's 300 fewer restaurants this year than there were at the beginning of last year because they've closed. And so the price of food and the price of labor has made the restaurant business, which has always been one that operated on the margin, very, very challenging.
True.
And you talk to any restaurateur, and that's what they'll tell you is that I just can't afford to stay open anymore.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Well, we haven't solved that problem. Let's move on to the next one. The primaries are coming up. Colorado and Maine have decided that they're not going to put Trump on the ballot, or they're still basically bickering about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we'll see. First of all, nothing would make me happier than seeing Donald Trump disqualified for office because he's just bad for America, bad for the country. I wish he was off. The problem is he was set up in a way where he was probably going to go an offer on all of these court cases and lose all of them. But now he's going to probably win, and he's probably going to stay on the ballot. And I actually am in the middle of a video course on Reconstruction. We had the 14th Amendment yesterday, which was originally designed to keep former American military and congressional people who had taken an oath, who then went with the Confederacy from getting back into government. I mean, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, actually was subsequently elected to the House and to the Senate from Georgia and served. So they passed this as a way to restrict not all, but certain members of the Confederacy from taking office. Today, Colorado said, okay, the court made a finding, okay, you engaged in insurrection and you are an eligible officer under the meaning of the 14th Amendment because you took an oath, and therefore we can disqualify you. And there are some issues procedurally with that. Mm-hmm. The first is the due process issue. So in today's Wall Street Journal, a Yale law professor, and just so you know, because we used to hire kids from both schools, the Yale kids were always smarter than the Harvard kids. But Professor Jed Rubenfeld writes that in 1869, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, Lincoln's appointee as Chief Justice, decided that a person could be disqualified from office under Section 3 only if Congress so provides in a statute and under the procedures laid out in the statute. Now, Congress in 1870 did, in fact, adopt a statute of insurrection. This was a circuit court decision, so therefore Colorado was not obligated to follow it, because in those days the Supreme Court justices rode the circuit. And Section 3 itself doesn't require a criminal conviction, but that was Salmon Chase's holding back in 1869 that you needed to be convicted under the statute of insurrection. What's interesting is that Jack Smith and the rest of them, Fannie Willis et al., while they've charged Trump with 91 felonies, have not charged him with insurrection. They've charged him with other things, interfering with the federal election, interfering with workings of government, et cetera, but not insurrection. And in Maine, it's even less because there you have a person making an administrative bureaucratic decision without a trial, without a finding of conviction, and putting them off the ballot. And you run the risk that if every state can do that, any state can do that. And a lot of people will look at Joe Biden and say, we think you were an agent of a foreign government. There's no real conviction of that, but we've got these emails that Comer has put out.
Right.
So we're going to make a finding that you are an agent of a foreign government and therefore engaged in actions of treason, and we're going to take you off the ballot in Texas or whatever other state. Lincoln wasn't on Lincoln only got 39% of the popular vote because he wasn't on the ballot in many of the southern states. Oh. You could have a case where the primary candidates for both the Democrats and Republicans just don't even appear. And obviously that would be chaotic.
The thing that gets me the most is that we need to defeat Trump in a decisive, clear way. And if you take him off the ballot, then there's going to be a question mark in any state. If you take him off the ballot in any state, you're going to have that question and fodder for rigged election. And that is the thing that bothers me the most. And I think that the way it's playing out, it's going to have to be the voters that decide the country's future. And it may not be something you and I like at the end of the day, but they need to decide who's going to be the next president. And that involves the election to be as fair as possible, to be as fair to even a criminal as possible, to prove that the man isn't elected. Now, he's going to say he didn't lose anyway, but it has to be very clear that he lost the election. And it's not going to be clear if he's not on some of the ballots. Would you agree?
I think that's exactly right. And, it's going to be worse than the Kennedy administration. There'll be conspiracy theories for generations after this if he's taken off by means that the public generally believes to be unfair.
Okay. There's some other things I want to cover, but we're going to have some other shows. We're going to try to be here every week. So we're going to table those for the moment, as they say, and talk about some books you've read that you found to be very informative and interesting.
Well, I've had some long cruises this year and some time during the holidays. And so my golf game is in the bag. So I've been reading books, and I want to share with our viewers just a couple of them. A short book. It's called Christianity and Liberalism. It was written in 1923. So it's 100 years old.
Wow.
And the author talks about creeping, not political liberalism, but theological liberalism in the church. And his concern about that is sort of a warning from a noted minister of the time. But that was the issue in 1923, 100 years ago, was liberalism in the church. And I point that out because exactly 100 years later, Tim Alberta has written a book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which is really one of the best books I have ever read. And it is a heartbreaking book if you're a person of faith. Tim is a writer for The Atlantic. He wrote the book American Carnage, which is the definitive description of how the populist group took over the Republican Party. And he is the son of an evangelical minister from Michigan. He was in the process of doing radio interviews talking about his previous book. And Rush Limbaugh trashed him on the air. And his father died, and he was going back to Michigan to do the eulogy for his father. And after he did the eulogy in the church that he grew up in, he was there in the reception line, and people would come up to him and berate him for what they'd heard on the Limbaugh show, and berate him for his politics, and for being a rhino, and for being a traitor to the cause. And he found that to be very disconcerting. And he traveled around the country from coast to coast, and he visited churches where the MAGA movement had made an impact. Pastors being driven from the pulpit who failed to properly toe the line politically. He saw ministers who wore guns and camouflage to church and had a rant hour where they did 15 minutes on politics before they did the sermon. He saw all kinds of hucksters and grifters selling "Let's Go Brandon" t-shirts. And in case you didn't get what that really meant, it was hashtag FJB in churches. And he spends a lot of time with the Southern Baptists because there have been a lot of faith leaders who have seen this and been disturbed about it and have put up red flags and who have been kicked out of their jobs for it, frankly. And people who had been previous leaders under Jerry Falwell, like Cal Thomas, who had his own sort of, if you will, come to Jesus movement and has written about the abuses there. And Alberta comes to the conclusion that the church has decided that in these culture wars, where we're fighting against the forces of big, bad godliness, we need somebody as big and bad and as godless as they are to take them on. And that is such an obviously theologically flawed position that I won't go into it. But if you're a person of faith, it is just a heartbreaking book to read because it shows the corruption of the church. Jesus was very clear when he was on earth, and despite people urging him to do so, that he was not going to use the corruptible institution of government to accomplish his kingdom on earth. And we should take that to heart because it's been a corrupting influence. It's caused churches to split. And it's a story that I think every American, and particularly my Republican friends and Republican peoples of faith, should read the book and understand the story.
Yeah, this gentleman has been on the talk show circuit plugging this particular book as well. And it is heartbreaking what happened to the guy. It just really is. And you can tell that he is emotionally affected by what has happened to him. So, it's I haven't read the book, but I know the man's work. And yes, it's something that everybody should absolutely take a look at it, especially if you are a person of faith.
I do have some other books, though. Matei Coppins, who was also with The Atlantic. The Atlantic has become sort of the go-to place for political commentary, has written a great book called Romney, A Reckoning. And he was given unprecedented access to travel with Romney, to read his diaries, to spend a lot of time talking with him. And you watch the arc of Mitt Romney's, who was a dedicated Mormon. He went on a Mormon mission to France. He was actually driving a car that had an accident, and the bishop of the local area was killed in the car accident. His father was governor of Michigan and a very early civil rights advocate. His father was born in Mexico while on a mission. So he's got a much more empathetic view towards people than he ever got credit for. And it's a very sad story, and I could relate to it thoroughly as I read it, of his disillusion with politics once he got to the Senate and while he was a presidential candidate, about the compromises and things he had to do. So it's a sad story, but it's a good story, and I do recommend it. I have two more.
Okay.
The Drift. Now, this is actually by Kevin Hassert. Kevin was one of the smart guys in the Trump administration. He was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. And he documents his fights internally with people like Steve Bannon and with the others who were, Peter Navarro most notably, who were sort of blow it all up kind of guys. And he documents sort of the Trump economic victories. And there were economic victories. And that's one of the reasons that Biden's having so much trouble now. And people sort of long for the good old days of Trump. They probably misremember them a little bit. But it's a very good book for a guy who does his own mea culpas about the administration and documents his own conflicts. But it tells people, and again, my Democratic friends often have a difficult time understanding, why do you like those policies and not our policies? This, I think, will do that.
Okay.
And finally, for those of you who would like to read about biased media driving elections and who would like to read about charges of economic impropriety and adultery and candidates going all off the reservation and seeing America divided amongst its one on one side of a foreign war and others on the other side of a foreign war, and not being able to figure out which side we should be for, dirty campaign tactics, anonymous social media posts, fights over the national debt, money interest versus, from the banks and the cities and the merchants versus the farmers, and how those issues play out. I recommend to you H.W. Brand's The Founding Partisans, because all of those issues were present in the 1790s. And all of them were involved, our founding fathers, Jefferson and Hamilton most notably, but also Washington and Adams and Madison, who were key players in all of this. And you realize, as they say in Ecclesiastes, that everything old is new again. But very similar to the fights that we're having today about the nature of the government and what it should be doing and should not be doing. And if you think campaigns are dirty today, I'll just tell you that they were dirty in 1788 and 1786 and 1800 particularly. So there you have it. That's my reading list for the year. And H.W. Brands, by the way, is one of my favorite historians. He's written particularly good books on Franklin Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson and the Texas Revolution. He's a professor at University of Texas, but he's written a lot of things, and I recommend all of them.
We probably should have done this before Christmas, because it sounds like these are would have been some great Christmas buys for Christmas gifts. All right. I think we should probably wrap it up. Is there anything else that's on the front burner now that we need to discuss before we go to next week?
The campaigns are getting into the short strokes, and we'll see how it plays out.
Absolutely. Okay. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us on another edition of Red versus Blue. Please subscribe to the podcast. If you subscribe through iTunes or other places where you can leave a review, please leave us a review, a positive 5-star, if possible. And join us again next week for another edition of Red versus Blue.
Thanks, everybody.